meantime, this was a very dramatic modern space that drew people in. Okay, has anybody heard of Sister Parish or Parish Hadley? Now that firm, as I said, that's why I do this lecture, or that's why I put it together. This Parish Hadley has only been closed since 2002. Albert Hadley, who was her partner and who only died about a year and a half ago. Albert Hadley, as I said, was in his own business after that. Sister Parish was called Sister, people refer to her as Sister Parish. Nobody did to her face except her family. She was called Mrs. Parish, as Eleanor Macmillan Brown was called Mrs. Brown when she married. Everybody in her office, apparently, even her contemporaries, called her Mrs. Brown. After her death, they all, anybody I've heard who worked there referred to us as Mrs. Brown. Life was more formal then. But Sister Parish, I told you about this being appropriate to women of a certain level. She was social. She came from a very fine family with more prestige perhaps than money. Her husband was having difficulties, financial difficulties during the Depression, and so she went out to do something that was acceptable. She found she could earn some money by decorating, and she opened up a business. And she didn't run it as very much of a business, but she was decorating for friends and people who introduced her to other people who wanted a decorator for a look that didn't look like a decorator came in and did. Her interiors, this is sort of typical of the Parish look. Mixed patterns, casually put together, needlepoint pillows. She used the women, her family house, I put Maine up there to remind me to tell you, she used woven things like this wicker, which might have been brought up at a local flea market. She would have pillows and rugs woven by the local women. Local women doing weaving and doing needlepoint. She'd buy that and use that in her interiors. So that they looked really, it was, when anybody refers to what is Sister Parish's look, they say the undecorated look. And her own bedroom, and I felt that these were typical of the look. She did use a lot of pattern and mixed up patterns, but this didn't look like Victorian. She didn't put pattern on the walls most of the time, and it was clutter, but it was studied clutter. And this was in her apartment in New York, where she carried the look and maybe made it a bit more sophisticated than she would have in the country. So this is dressed up. And she was prominent enough to be invited to redecorate. This is, I guess, the Oval Room or the Yellow Room in the White House. And various designers have been called in at various times to work on a given room in the White House or to consult. Most recently, it's a while ago, in the 90s, Mario Bawada and Mark Hampton were both asked to do rooms at Blair House, which is the vice presidential house. Jamie Drake redecorated the, what's the mayor's?
Gracie Mansion.
But he was already working for Mayor Bloomberg, but no one has taken over completely. But there has been the tradition of hiring a named designer. And in this case, it's another point, they would have, I'm sure, donated their services. Talking about designer getting publicity. You're invited to do the White House, you're not going to charge for that. That's a great good business. So who came after that? It changed a little bit, it got a little bit more professional. Billy Baldwin, who was sort of untrained. He studied art. He built up a decorating business. He went to work for somebody in Baltimore, where he was from. He built up a business there, became known enough there so that Ruby Ross Wood invited him to come and work for her, with her. And he did, and when she died, he continued the firm on his own. He took in another partner, Baldwin and Martin, but he was the brains. Also, if you look at him, I thought he reminds me of all the pictures I've seen of the Duke of Windsor. And, small, slight, very fashionable. Apparently he was very charming. and also an socialized with all his clients. Wrote 3 decorating books, and one sort of a memoir. And they weren't, see, by this point, it's not a book on how to decorate. It's a book on this is what I do. This is what I've done. Oh, I didn't tell you about Dorothy Drake's book. She wrote one called Decorating is Fun, and another called Entertaining is Fun, which is sort of take the mystery out of it. It's for everybody to enjoy. Billy Baldwin, and another person who I didn't put in, William Pullman, who I've thought is under-recognized, mainly because there's one book and an old decorating book. William Pullman did the interior of the Four Seasons, which is always credited as the Four Seasons restaurant, which is credited to Philip Johnson, who did architecture. But apparently William Pullman's, and I've authenticated this in several documents. He's the one who had the idea of putting the pool in the middle of the room and changing the decor for the seasons. But anyway, and he wrote a decorated column that in the 80s, when I was starting in this business, he was the most famous decorator. He wrote a column that was in hundreds of newspapers around the country. And what happened is fame in this field is short-lived, because unlike a fashion designer like Chanel, where it can be carried on with the name and clothing can still be made, for the most part, designers and architects, well, they're not always architects, if you have a big firm, but you die, you have a talent. When you're gone, it doesn't endure, and unfortunately, sadly, the next generation doesn't necessarily know you, which is what my cause is. It's also, as designers, you need to know about the tradition of your profession. You need to know about the history of your profession. And by the time you leave school, you should have looked through old books and studied old magazines so that you know how decorating changed. And you're not going to copy what somebody else did. But who's to say that you wouldn't look at something by Dorothy Draper and say, that gives me an idea of something I can do in my way? Because ideas don't come from nowhere. They come from looking at things, and you need to look at more than just what's around you right now. You need to look at what people who did a good job in this business have been doing. And that doesn't mean that I think you should design this kind of thing now, but I think you should know what was done. This was his very celebrated apartment in Amsterdam, you see, in the 40s. And this is, fairly classic. This was very modern, simpler than it was, and the dark walls were very advanced for the time. He famously designed a library for Cole Porter, which updated, and I'll explain them because it's hard to see. He took the bookcases that were in Regency English bookcases, which were ebony and brass, and modernized them. And they're done with, brass on the facade and brass strips on the shelves. And then apparently the mechanism of, the things that jut out, the supports that you put the shelves on. He designed the supports in a very ingenious way. We don't have to know how. But I saw diagrams of those. So he was very inventive, designing something. I assumed that the shelves were adjustable, and that was the point of designing them. And it's a very light scale. What else it is in being light scale, it's a modern take on a Victorian bookshelf. And in his own home, this was his later home in I believe this the 1970s, I also believe this was further uptown. And what he did is the lacquered dark walls, these are black lacquer. He reused a lot of furniture that you see, if you see images of his various apartments, he's reusing the same pieces and reupholstering them. These are the slipper chairs I mentioned to you. And he used these in practically every client job I've seen. And the other side of this room, which was a large studio, I saw photographs of a couple of the apartments or redos, and what he did is just reupholster the sofa. and used needlepoint pillows, but they weren't the kind of pillows that would have been used earlier. This is cane, but it's a modern take on cane. This room was on a House and Garden cover, and what you see here very ingeniously is he took the Matisse as an inspiration for designing instead of black on white, the upholstery is white on black, and the black and white and the carpet. And this is a very sophisticated room. And would we call it now? I guess you wouldn't call it a modern room, in that it's not all modern furniture. But for its time, it's treated in a modern way, okay? Or it's treating the structure very simply. It's mixing periods with very, very discriminating eye. And this is a rather well-known room he did for a woman named Mary Wells Lawrence, who was president of an ad agency, which was a big deal at the time because she was the first woman president of an ad agency. She married a client, and the client was the president of Braniff Airways, which is since defunct, but Braniff was a big deal. And Braniff, I think, headquartered in Texas. And he was very design-minded too. There were ads, now I remember this, Braniff painted their planes colors, and they dressed the stewardesses in, I can't remember his name, in high fashion clothing. I mean, they had a fashion designer dress the stewardess in clothes, which was all her idea. So she hired the hot designer of the time to do their plays in Italy. And this was done, the geometric carpet, I'm going to show you an interior by David Hicks, who's a British designer, who popularized all of a sudden black and white or dark and white geometric crisscross motifs on floor covering, wall covering, and upholstery. Was something a big deal. Less on the walls, but floor covering and upholstery. It's not that nobody ever did this before, it's that all of a sudden that was the hot thing to use this year. Just as there will be a hot color or a particular look. As nowadays, I can't think of anything in interiors. I can think that last season everybody was talking about leopard prints, or animal skin prints. A couple of years ago, animal upholstery was big. There'll be that kind of trend that we'll see coming up, rather than a particular style of furniture that you could give a label to. Now there is too much diversity of style to say what is the thing this season. Last real influence of the time in